G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back for another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at my season predictions for Formula 1 and F1 Fantasy. So if you are new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we get into my F1 Fantasy boom or bust expectations for certain drivers, I'd like to do my season predictions very quickly first. We'll go through my drivers and constructors winners, my top 3 for the championship, and a driver that pops and a driver that flops throughout 2025. The honour for the Drivers' Championship that I predict will take it out is Charles Leclerc. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering why I'm that deluded Ferrari fan, but I am. And a lot of that probably speaks to my passion and desire to see Ferrari come out on top in the Drivers' Championship. Now, Charles, in my opinion, is coming off the most complete season as a driver. I'd say even though he finished P3 in the Drivers' Championship in 2024, I believe it was a more overall holistic and complete season than he had in 2022, which was also a championship-winning car back then. It was, however, a season back then in 2022 that was very dogged with inconsistencies, mechanical gremlin, reliability, that kind of stuff that he just didn't have in 2024. And I think it's going to show that if he can build on those kind of results, he had 3 wins and 13 podiums last season versus only 11 podiums and 3 wins in 2022. Suggests to me he can very much mix it with the guys at the front. I think Lando Norris, Max Verstappen absolutely deserve to be in the conversation as well. But if Ferrari can deliver a championship winning car, and there are reports in the off season that they're changing something like 90 to 95% of the Ferrari, that is very much possible. I could see Charles atop the driver's standings at season end. I think a lot has to go right for him. And the fact that he's also going up against Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time World Drivers' Championship winner, goes to show to me that he'll want to prove all of the doubters and the critics wrong and demonstrate he can beat a world championship. Sure, he's had Vettel, he's had Sainz in the past, very competitive teammates for sure, but at different stages of their career. And sure, I think Hamilton, again, another one that's probably only got a couple more years at most left in the sport. I think notwithstanding that, it's another arrow in Charles's bow. If he can outperform Hamilton over an entire season, very much gives him the belief that he can also win a championship. So he's my pick of the bunch for F1 Drivers' Championship 2025. The constructor's honour for me has to go to McLaren. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris, one of only 2 teams with the same driver pairing as what was in 2024. And I think they deserve to be favourites. They've had 6 wins in 2024, a bunch of podiums, and even though there were some inconsistencies and concerns around strategy and such last season, for the most part, they had the most complete and competitive package among all teams. And I think that extra year of experience working together will certainly work in their favour heading into this season. Lando and Oscar both got those monkeys off their back for their first wins. And even though they didn't make the most of the machinery, I think if they can deliver a competitive car from the outset, because we saw in 2023, they only had a good car for about half the season, and McLaren didn't really look good until Imola, Miami last season. So if they can be out of the gates, the best team on the grid with the best car, then I definitely think it sets themselves up nicely for winning the constructors. Now, Lewis and Charles, I think, another great and competitive teammate pairing in the top half of the grid. But you look at Red Bull, you look at Mercedes, they're bringing in rookie drivers. I just don't think there's going to be enough from Lawson or Kimi Antonelli to bring those 2 teams into the conversation. So I think by process of elimination for the constructors winner, it has to be McLaren for me again heading into this season. So my top 3 for this season is going to be Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen. I was agonizing over whether or not I want to put Max at 3rd or at 4th. And again, I think his class, his consistency shines through it. Very much, in my opinion, depends on Oscar's development this season and whether or not he can take that next step. I've obviously talked about Charles, and I think we know what Lando's capable of. Again, has to string together that consistency over a full season to prove he can win the championship. And I think it's going to be very tight between these 3 or even these 4 drivers at the top of the field this season. I think Max, again, it depends on the car, but they've lost Adrian Newey. I think that is a huge blow to them. And we saw that the Rebel was nowhere close to a top 2 car for the second half of last season. Do they turn things around? I think they do, but a lot of it will be very much hinging on Max's ability to outperform that Red Bull. And if there isn't really that change of fortunes with the car, then I do think Oscar slots into that second spot. But I do think it'll be extremely tight at the top, just like last season. I think the constructors and the drivers, or certainly the drivers and maybe the constructors, will go down to the wire by season's end. So Charles, Lando, Max are my top 3 for 2025. A driver who pops, Fernando Alonso, and give me a second to listen to me here. I think a pretty controversial option given how tragic Aston Martin were last season. And a lot of that hinges on a couple of huge factors for me. The first being Adrian Newey. I talked about the kind of problems losing Adrian Newey created for Red Bull. I think the opposite happens for Aston Martin. No, I don't think they're suddenly a top 3 or top 4 team on the grid. I think they are comfortably 5th, in my opinion. But I do think Adrian Newey, with a driver like Fernando Alonso's character and caliber, will absolutely result in a better performance on track for Aston Martin this time around. You add in the new wind tunnel that they've already been able to test out a little bit. I think that is a huge benefit, and the factory itself that Aston Martin are operating out of is a huge benefit for the team. And yeah, look, I think Fernando had a pretty middling 2024. Let's be honest. It wasn't anywhere close to the season he had in 2023. His best result last year was 5th. He finished 9th in the Drivers' Championship compared to 4th the year prior with 6 podiums in the first 8 races. I don't think a 9th or a 10th is going to be anything too crazy if that's where Fernando finishes again this time around. But I do think he's going to have more flashes of brilliance. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him on the podium a couple times this year, if again the car and the upgrades and the changes as a result of Newey's involvement with Aston Martin actually reaps the benefit. So look, a bit of a controversial take, but where are predictions, or what are predictions without a few spicy ones in the mix? And I don't want to go, oh, Charles Leclerc's going to pop because he's going to win the Drivers' Championship. I think that's a little bit boring, to be honest. So let's go for something spicy. And let's go with Fernando Alonso as a driver. I think that pops throughout the season. A driver that flops, Kimi Antonelli. Again, probably not the most obvious flop. We could go for a backmarker team, but I think Kimi comes into an environment at Mercedes where he's going to be under a lot of pressure. He's replacing a 7-time World Drivers' Championship. He's going up against a multi-2024 race winner in George Russell, and there's going to be a lot of expectation around him being this generational talent that, you know, has been compared to Max Verstappen and other World Championship winning drivers in the past. I think the pressure, no matter what Toto Wolff says, is going to be there. And realistically, I think that could well play on his mind. It may not. Maybe he is one of those cool heads we've seen from other rookies. But Kimi has a lot of pressure. He's very young. He's the youngest driver on the grid. And realistically, in a team that's expected to contend for podiums week in, week out, maybe that's too much. I don't know. George Russell, he's going to be the leader of the team, no doubt. I think Kimi will put George under pressure at various points throughout the season, but I think it's going to be night and day between those two. And George will definitely up the ante as taking on that leadership role in the team. So Kimi, I think we'll see more improvement. We'll see better results from him in the second half of the year once he's really bedded in. But no matter what Toto Wolff and the Mercedes brass say, Kimi is the one that I think is going to struggle a little bit once he gets acclimated to the car, because there are other rookies on the grid that have dabbled in F1 already, Lawson, Behrman, etc. I think Kimi's got his work cut out, to be honest. And look, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I think there's a lot of pressure riding on this young kid, and let's see how 2025 goes for him. Now let's get on to my boom and bust for F1 Fantasy. I got a couple of guys on screen here, and this is purely from an F1 Fantasy lens. I could have lumped these into other predictions on the previous page, but let's look at both of these drivers from an F1 Fantasy perspective. Let's start with Oscar Piastri. Oscar started last season priced at around 19 million or so in a McLaren that in the second half of 2023 was very competitive. I think he very much showed his worth as a fantasy asset last season. I think that's going to continue into 2025 as well. And I think he's also going to become a go-to option for the 2X. Why do I say that? Because last season we saw a lot of people capitalize on B-tier drivers as their 2X option while also having reliable constructors from the get-go. I think Oscar will be a very popular 2X option from the beginning at what I think has to be under 25 million. I think he's going to be at the upper end of that pricing scale, but he's just not in the same price class as the Charles Leclerc's, as the Lando Norris's, as the Max Verstappen's. So I think at an affordable range of 22 to 24 million, that gives him enough growth as a B tier asset to still capitalize on those price gains before becoming an A tier out of reach. I also love that reliability. Oscar had 0 DNFs in 2024. It was very well documented how good he was with that car and getting around the track. The engine itself, also exceptionally reliable. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I'm pretty sure McLaren haven't had a mechanical failure since the start of 2023, since Bahrain when Oscar did retire. So the fact they've gone almost a full 2 seasons without a mechanical failure Excuse me. Let me just take a sip from my Las Vegas Grand Prix water bottle. But let Oscar demonstrate that reliability and that consistency in a very competitive car. I think the fact as well that if he does end up in the B tier asset class, he becomes, from the get-go at least, a very popular asset, and he's capable of winning, he's capable of being on the podium. All factors of a fantasy asset you want in your team. A set and forget option who's going to score you 20 to 30 points most race weeks, if I'm being completely honest. So I do like the appeal of Oscar. Again, depends on his price. He is going to be in what many people expect to be the championship winning car. But I do think if he comes in under 24 million, he becomes a very compelling option to start out in our fantasy teams in Australia. The other driver I think that has boom potential is Ollie Bearman. Ollie raced in Formula 1 3 times last season. At times he looked more comfortable in an F1 car than he did an F2 car. He finished 12th in F2, and I've got a couple of his stats on screen here. He came away with a handful of sprint wins, obviously finished on the podium all 3 times. But he did look very, very comfortable in F1 when he deputized in place of Carlos Sainz in Saudi Arabia, and then also replaced K-Mag in Azerbaijan and again in Brazil. So I do like Bearman. He's looked very good in the very small sample of races he's had so far, and realistically the kind of driver that I think is going to be cool and calm under pressure. Look, Haas is not a championship winning car, but they are going to be scrapping in the midfield. He went toe-to-toe with many experienced drivers in the 3 races he had in 2024. I very much expect that kind of take no prisoners attitude again this time around. But I think in terms of his boom or bust potential, I've got him as a boom primarily because of the fact we've seen that consistency. He's a bit of a proven commodity. Look, maybe we said that about Nick De Vries a couple seasons ago in that singular race we saw from him in Monza. But notwithstanding that, I do think where he comes in at as a driver will very much dictate his popularity from the get-go. I think 8 to 10 is about fair for him because Haas is a upper midfield car, and upper midfield drivers typically come in around 7 to 10 million. I think Carlos Sainz will be an outlier, and we'll get onto him in just a second as a teaser. But I do think 8 to 10 seems like a fair price for Ollie. Sure, he was a little higher when he was a Haas driver last season, but I think that's partly because F1 got the pricing wrong for him when he returned compared to when he was a Ferrari asset. So these 2 guys are my boom assets for F1 Fantasy. Let's get on to my bust potential assets. Carlos Sainz, my first bust potential driver for 2025. I think Carlos Sainz is a bit of an interesting one in F1 fantasy circles, purely because his entry point price will dictate whether or not people are willing to jump on him from the first couple of races of the season. He's coming off his best ever F1 fantasy result with Ferrari 5th in the drivers and averaged more than 22 points in fantasy per race last season. He also came away with a couple of wins in Saudi Arabia and then again in Mexico. So I do think he's got that pedigree of winning races and finishing on the podium. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen all that frequently, if at all, in Williams. And for that reason, because of that recent form, but going into a midfield team, which looked grossly off the pace at various points last season, I worry Carlos could be a little overpriced. I think he'll come in under 15 million. I think he'll be an expensive C-tier asset though. And even though he is a safe pair of hands, certainly more so than the Albons, the Sargents, the Colapintos of the world in Williams, I do think that quality may actually play into his detriment as a fantasy asset. If he comes in under 10 million, I think the argument makes itself for bringing Carlos into your team, coming into your team as a C-tier driver. But I just don't see that happening. And if he comes in under 10 million, I think it's a bit more of an argument. But right now, I'm just not so sure Carlos comes in below 11 or 12 million. Fernando Alonso, a similar example, a driver that at Aston Martin, probably a mid-range car as we know. Williams is not a mid-range car. They're a comfortably bottom 2 car at the moment. But Carlos Sainz, I wouldn't be surprised if he's priced similarly to Fernando Alonso, who was 15.8 to start 2024, the only driver actually that went down in price from his starting season price. So I worry Carlos, given he is a very good driver, he will qualify quite high relative to the car itself and certainly his teammate Albon. may actually not work out so well if he turns in Hulkenberg-like performances like we saw in 2024, where he qualifies somewhere between P8 and P12 and then kind of just sits there the entire race. Doesn't really gain any positions, doesn't really make too many overtakes. So for that reason, I'm a bit skeptical on Carlos Sainz. But again, I think his price will very much dictate what that means for him as an F1 fantasy asset. Now, Kimi Antonelli, we've talked about him already, and maybe unfairly as well. Look, I do actually like Kimi. He seems like a very charming driver, full of potential, but I'm not going to keep gassing the guy up. I think as a fantasy asset, not really so sure about him just yet. I'd happily be proven wrong, as I said, but he comes off back-to-back championships in the junior formulas and then finished 6th in F2 last season. His teammate was coincidentally Ollie Behrman, who we just talked about. He had 2 wins, one of which was a sprint last season, and finished on the podium 3 times. I think because of the fact that he is in a Mercedes, an objectively top of the range car, it's hard to see his price being below 15 million. I just can't see that. It becomes too obvious almost to bring in Kimi if he's anywhere below 16 million. I think he's a great option for building value and budget from the get-go as a B-tier driver, but I think it very much depends on what the rest of our team looks like before Kimi is in my thought process at the very least. I think because of the fact that they will be comfortably 4th in the standings, Kimi does present a compelling case. There won't really be any competition around him, maybe Fernando Alonso, maybe Carlos Sainz, but I don't really see too much if the car is as good as it was. It was, objectively better than the rest of the midfield, but maybe not quite on the same level as Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull. Then maybe Kimi becomes viable. I look at him similar to how I look at someone like Ollie Behrman when he came in for Ferrari in Saudi Arabia last year. Behrman was around 14, 15 million. I think Antonelli has to come in above 15 million, but I don't think it's going to be much more than that. So that's kind of where I see him, and I think that inexperience, unlike Behrman and Lawson as well, who we've seen have time in an F1 car already, certainly Lawson going into another top team, I think he'll be priced higher than Antonelli, but I do think Kimi can't really be much more than 16, 17 million, or it just doesn't become part of the conversation at all. So I'm curious to see what his price is like, but I think because of the fact he is a rookie in a top team, it's going to be hard to get the price right and strike a balance between whether or not you're getting the points value and the price gain out of him versus maybe other assets that are a couple of $1 million more. So anyway, that's my predictions for Formula One and my boom or bust potential assets in 2025. So if you enjoyed this content, please do drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. There's going to be so much more content coming out between now, pre-season testing in Bahrain, and the Australian Grand Prix. So as always, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.